everybody. I am Leanne Fleischer with NOAA Certified, and welcome to our Tiny Talks Workshop Wednesday, where we cover tiny neighborhood, village, community development. First and foremost, I gotta tell you that you are being recorded. That's that little red light up there at the upper left-hand corner. And if you don't want to be recorded, then we will see you tomorrow, where we'll still be recording.
I like the way you put that, Leanne.
Anyway, if you guys have any questions at all, you can put them in the chat. Otherwise, we're going to let these guys get going with their presentation because I know they have a lot to cover. So, Robin, you want to take over?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. Wonderful introduction there, Leanne. Thank you for handling things every day and that kind of thing. So yeah, we appreciate that. Also, if you don't want to put it in the chat, you could also, under reactions, you could raise your hand and then we can call on you and you could ask your question in person too. So that's a possibility too. So yeah, we're in the middle of tiny house developments, how to find the land, go all the way through, the build. We're in the middle of that, all the way through not only the build, but the sale and whether you're going to lease them or sell them or that. So from A to Z, tiny house communities, and we're focusing on that right now. Scott's been with us all along here, and in case you don't know, Scott's well versed in development of developments over 40 plus years in that, but he's also doing a tiny house development right now. So he's familiar with what a tiny house is and how it all works and how the municipalities look at it. So with Scott, Scott, you want to say hi to everyone?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us again today. And I look forward to working with each and every one of you and trying to see if we can help you get into the tiny home neighborhood development, community development.
Yeah, and tiny house developments are really good in a lot of respects for people that maybe want some retirement type income, or they just like to help out by. I don't want that, do I? I clicked the wrong one. Let me arrow down to the. There. Really, with communities, tiny house communities, you don't have to do all the work. A lot of times you can get partners in, but there's everything from like a small 13 unit that happened in Lake Dallas, Texas, to I think you're doing a 30 or 40 unit project, Scott, that you like that size a little bit better, and even larger. How much are you doing? How many?
We're doing 22, but what we're finding is in terms of the economies of scale, we want to bring it up to 40 to 60. And
40 to 60.
40 to 60. That seems to be a really good number for us to work with. So
we are, all of these are recorded so that if you want to go back and catch the ones before we're on the 6th day of these talks. So if you haven't seen the ones before that, we'll try to dumb it down a little bit today and review a little bit, but we're in the middle of finding the land, how to find the land, what to do to find your land. And we're on this slide right here that if you want to take it from there and talk to us a little bit about it, Scott.
Typically what happens when you buy any land, the majority of the landowners that we're going to deal with do not have surveys. They really don't have much technical data. Sometimes they do, and if they do, you're really lucky, but most of the times they don't. And when you go into the development process, when you go to talk to your local government, the first thing that they're always going to want is an up-to-date survey, and it's usually within 3 months to a year. Each municipality or county or whatever is a little bit different on what they require. Most of their documents that you need, applications, et cetera, are all online. So you can usually look in that and see what those requirements are. So what we always try to do is put down as little as possible at the very beginning, because we're going to go ahead and spend some money. So we're going to budget on a deal that we think we can do. Again, this is something that we've identified as a very good opportunity. We're going to probably spend between 10 and 25 grand to figure out that we are going to do the deal. I typically don't work on anything that I don't know that I can get rezoned. Sometimes it's a toss-up, but in Florida we have zoning and future land use, and those must be compatible in order to develop. So it's usually a quick phone call down to the planning and zoning department, give them the parcel ID number, and they'll tell you what the zoning is and what the future land use. And then a lot of times you can talk to somebody in community development. If it's a larger county or city, you can talk to community development, and then they'll tell you whether or not, yeah, there's a good chance we could change that future land use to such and such to allow you to do this. Or you can always do a PD, which is a plan development, or PUD, which is plan unit development. They're the same. And then do that. So a typical deal I would put down, let's say on a 50 unit project I was going to do, I put down $5,000. And then after I get it zoned, then this is where we get into the milestone deposits. So after we get zoning, which is usually our critical time. So we would do a initial due diligence period of, let's say 90 days, but make the whole deal subject to a rezoning if we're going through rezoning. If it's already zoned, then you could do your due diligence, and then at the end of due diligence, you would put down a higher deposit, maybe another 10 or 20 grand, depending on the size of the deal, that would be theoretically at that point at risk. And if you don't close, that they would get that. We typically will offer the seller our work product. So if we do a survey and we don't move forward with the deal, we'll just give them the survey. Some people want to try to sell that to their next subsequent buyer and stuff like that. But I always use that as a negotiation tool with my sellers to say, the reason I'm giving you such a low down payment, even $1,000 or $5,000, whatever, is that I'm going to give you this work product, and we're going to spend from 10 to 25 grand, depending on what we need to do to get comfortable with your property, Mr. or Mrs. Seller.
Scott, can you explain what subject to is? You said you do it subject to getting the zoning done?
Yeah, so the initial deposit we put up, let's say, is $5,000, and it's subject to getting the zoning. So if we don't get, and we usually have a time period in there, 6-8 months, whatever, to get the zoning done. If we can't accomplish that, we're either going to talk to the seller and extend that period, or probably walk away from the deal. That $5,000 deposit that we put up would be refundable until that period of time. So if I walk,
so subject to, so subject to means it's subject to that. In other words, if that doesn't happen, then you're not liable for going forward with the contract, and you can get your deposit back.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, cool. All right, let's move right along here. Let me see if I can move this down. All right. So another thing is shorten the time that you have to do things to mitigate the risk. And there's some things you can do ahead of time to shorten the time. So if you only have 90 days, there might be some things that you can do to shorten that. You know, after that 90 days, you want to have a lot of stuff done. So the longer that it takes for you to discover, find out stuff, it's not just it's not just the zoning, but you also have to find out if you can get water and sewer, find out, you know, how much that's going to cost to extend out there if they have to be extended out. See if you can get a access to the road. I know that one unit was on one parcel I had was on a curve, and you have to be able to look down the road. I think it's 200 feet or 300 feet before you could get access to that road. So there's other things that are out there, not just the zoning, And so if it takes a long time to find all that stuff out, you may not find it out before the 90 days is up, and you either have to go ahead and put the additional deposit down and make the contract hard, or and take a chance. But there's some this slide is just saying you can do some things ahead of time to help that out. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we a lot of what we do at the very initial stage is figure out some of those quick answers. So if, let's say I'm looking at a property, I'm looking at one right now in Seminole County. So what I did was I called up the planning and zoning department and talked to a gal named Annie, and I told her what the parcel ID number was, and I said, what can we really do here? And she said, well, we're looking at that area, and we would really like to see a mixed use development there, and we're going to want to make sure that there's some retail commercial, at least on the front portion of the property. So she said, you know, pay your do a concept plan or a sketch plan, and then come in and sit and talk with us. And it's $150, and it takes 2 or 3 weeks to get scheduled, and come in, and then they'll bring, that's called a pre-app meeting, pre-application meeting, and they'll bring their water and sewer people and the environmental people, and everybody will come in and say what they think that we need to do and whether or not it's remotely possible. So as an aside here, I've got a big meeting with Volusia County Friday morning, where we're going in and presenting a concept plan, and we're trying, that Volusia County is extremely progressive with their Affordable Housing Act. And that's a long story. I won't get into all that right now, but they're bringing in the whole team. So I'm getting the water, I'm getting utilities, environmental, stormwater management, police and fire, everybody's coming in. And we're looking at doing the tiny house neighborhood, our 22 lot deal, as a demonstration project where they can use House Bill 1339 to override the existing zoning on the property and make it an administrative thing. They're going to actually probably send it to planning and zoning and to the county council. But I think what they're going to do is tell them that this is what we're doing, or we being them, the county staff, this is what they're doing, and get kind of a blessing on it, because the county council's already approved the right for staff to use 1339. So it's really kind of interesting. This is kind of minutia stuff, but in this particular case, it's like a pre-app meeting, except it's going to be a little bit more because we're trying to determine a policy that the county can follow in multiple projects in the future. So we're trying to get it right on the first time. A lot of this is brand new, because the city of Rockledge, Wildwood, Brevard County, a lot of cities have done some work on a tiny home ordinance, but it's like Wildwood, where there's just 2 pages on it, and nobody really thought it through. And so in order to, you know, trying to make a 4 to 12 unit project work is pretty difficult. I mean, you could do it, but it's, you know, your entryway, for example, is going to be the same as a 50 unit project. And, you know, and when you start dividing stuff by 10 or 12, or dividing it by 50, it makes a huge difference on a per cost basis. And then when, like Robin mentioned on the utilities is an easy call. What we typically do is I'll call the city or county utility department and say, here's my parcel ID number, you know, where the utility is located. When I'm out looking for land, one of my key things that I look at is fire hydrants. If I see a fire hydrant along the side of a road, guess what that means?
Water, at least.
You got city water or county water. And then a lot of times when they have central sewer wastewater, you'll see manholes in the middle of the street. So if they have city water, they're going to have a manhole every 500 feet. And every time there's an intersection, like, you know, you're driving along road A and you're going to turn right to go onto road B, there's going to be a manhole there. Once you see that, you can look at the top of the manhole and it'll say sewer on it. So you know that there's water, city water, county water, and sewer at the site or in front of the site or near the site or whatever. It gets very expensive to run utility lines. And that's typically only done when you have a larger project, 60, 100 plus units, because the cost of that starts to make your project numbers fall apart.
Well, that makes sense. That's good information, guys. So, we think, well, this is my first project. I just want to do a small unit of 12, but the numbers, and we'll get later on in the pro forma of what the numbers look like, but the numbers don't work on that as well as on a 50 or 60. That's good information, Scott. Now, at the pre-op meeting, are you in contract? Do you have property tied up at that point?
Yes, usually 99% of the time.
With a letter of intent or an actual down payment?
Either or. We use, for the bigger properties, we use letters of intent. For smaller properties, we go straight to a contract. And for that contract, as we talked about last couple times already, is we use the FAR Bar Vacant Land Contract, which is Florida Association of Realtors, Florida Bar Association, put together a standard contract that everybody's used to seeing. So we do that, and then we add a pretty easy 3-page addendum to it that we've been using for 30 years that puts out the more specific things. Like closing, we always put closing 30 to 45 or 60 days after all the entitlements are issued. A lot of times we have to come back on that, but that's what we like to do if we can. A lot of sellers don't want to go out more than a year. So we try to cage things to get them into 10 or 11 months. And if we're nice to the sellers, and this is where some of the deposits will work, let's say I need a couple more months, what I can do to the sellers is go to them and either give them a little more price or a little more deposit at risk, and they'll give me more time. Like if I know I'm getting the approvals. Most of the
One
time,
of the things, yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Most of the time, once you have your zoning and land use in place, the majority of it after that is technical. That's where your civil engineer and your team comes in. Your geotechnical, the environmental, and traffic, and all those people. But it's just usually, not always, but most of the time, it becomes technical after that. So, your water has to flow downhill. You have to have a certain amount of retention. Yada, 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 yada. So that becomes technical, and it's not going back to the government for approval.
So it's just a matter of we've got the right zoning approval, then we can go. The project is a go usually at that point, and it's just a matter of doing the applications and drawings and getting them through there. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and with your team, you have let's say your preliminary environmental. So he's going to say, okay, this little piece over here is wet, so you got to work around that. And then he'll tell you that in your county or city, there's a 25 to 75 foot buffer around it. And he'll tell you which one it is. And so you have to stay outside of that. And a lot of times, if we're doing a typical subdivision type thing, is we'll put the retention between the upland and that wetland so that when the water flows there, it can, what they call pop off when it hits a certain level. Like if you drive along your roads, like let's say the 417, and you'll see these retention ponds out there, and you'll see these green things, concrete structures in the retention pond. Most of the time, those are what they call pop-off structures. So when the water in the pond fills to a certain level, it then goes into that and goes in a pipe to someplace else. Like going to another, into a wetland or whatever. And a lot of times the agencies government likes the water when it hits a certain level to pop off into the wetland, so it rehydrates the wetlands.
Right.
The other thing that happens is that's typically lower land, and so it costs less to fill it if you're not filling it.
Right. But it also takes up real estate that you can't use, so you have to factor that into your whole project and make sure that the project's going to work with that buffer and the wetlands taken out of your project.
Yeah, but you would figure that up way up front.
Okay.
So once you're zoned, that you would know that you could do 10 units or 20 units or 50 units or whatever you could do because of any development constraints.
Got it.
Like where's your access? I mentioned last week that we're working on a site, 750 feet of frontage, and we're going to get our access permit from the county because it's a county road. And they said we have to be 300 feet away from 2 other roads on either end, which was perfect because we could go at right in the middle of the 750 at 375, and we comply with the regulations. So pretty much set where our entrance was going to be. But we learned that
Right.
real early up front, so we could design around it. It wasn't like we were finding that out, when we were getting zoned. That was an initial due diligence item that we found out really early, so we could deal
Yeah,
with it.
and that could make or break the deal if you couldn't get in there where you or you'd have to do a special exception or something. But so you want to find that out within that 90-day period.
Right.
And one of the things you said, I wanted to share a story. I had a contract with someone that I was to perform certain things, some certain work that was needed to be done. And then once that work was finished, I was going to close 45 days after the completion of that work. You had mentioned something about closing, so many days after you get your entitlement approval or something like that. I had a problem with that contract in that once the work was finished, the seller said, "Oh, well, I like what you did. I think I'm going to keep it, so I'm not going to sell it to you." And when I tried to sue for specific performance, I almost lost because of one thing. You can't have, the attorney said you can't have an open-ended contract. You can say 45 days after the completion, but no longer than a year. You have to have some kind of a closure at the end of that contract. And I remembered that for a long time because we finally got it, but it took me 2 years to get it. But it was kind of a learning process that there are certain things in contracts that you have to be careful about. It is really anything you and the seller can work into. However, there are certain things like that could make it what they call unenforceable. And you don't want anything in your contract that would make it unenforceable.
We just went through one of those over in Titusville. I was the broker on a deal, and we had an open-ended contract that was closed 45 days after the entitlements. And finally, at the 2.5-year point, the sellers were going absolutely batshit nuts. They were really unhappy, but they extended out for 2.5 years and then finally got denied, believe it or not. I mentioned that story a couple of weeks ago with because of the commissioners. 2 of the commissioners were up for re-election. And so, but anyway, I don't mean to contradict you there, but I mean, we've seen it the other way too.
Well, I think if they didn't close, then you would have to sue for specific performance. And if it wasn't enforceable, that's when you would have a problem. But it sounds like in your situation, they wanted to close. And because you had it written in there, they kept, ungrudgingly extending the contract out till it ended out to 2.5 years.
Just because we're talking about specific performance in the Florida standard FLORBAR contract, the seller has the right typically to keep the deposit, and then it says or enforce actions against the buyer. I will not sign a contract whereby that after they get the deposit back, there's a period and I cross off the rest of those next 2 sentences, because you as a buyer do not want the seller to have the right to go against you for specific performance unless you're doing it in a pure shell company that has no assets.
Huh, interesting.
Because if not, they could hold you up, and then let's say you're going for financing they sue you for specific performance to close, and then you're going for financing, and one of the questions on the personal financial statement is, are you involved in any lawsuits? And you have to put down that I'm being sued for specific performance. Nobody likes that.
Right. Interesting. So anyway, spending a little bit too much time on here, but it is interesting to me. I don't know if it's interesting to anybody else, but We can have our team chosen and ready to go beforehand, before we even sign the contract. We can know, kind of what we made some phone calls. We looked at the property. We sketched out something on a piece of paper. We kind of know how many units we can put on there. And then this last point here, what do you do? What's your exit strategy if the entitlements fail? Is your only exit strategy just lose your deposit and go on to the next one, or is there another exit strategy that you can think of?
Well, I think it depends on what you have and what you're trying to do. I worked for a big company at one time, and we got blown out by a neighborhood. I mean, it was in Sarasota. They were really, really powerful. We had an exit strategy and we sold it to a church.
Okay. So you could sell, if you've already closed on it, you can always turn around and sell it and hopefully recoup some of your losses.
Or all of it, or more.
Or all of it. Make a profit, maybe, if you get a good deal on the land. Okay.
Right.
All right. So that's another exit strategy, guys. What's a letter of intent? How's it work?
A letter of intent typically is a 2 or 3 page document that sets out who the seller is. Let's say I go and talk, and typically most of our deals, we go and talk to a seller. So we have kind of a handshake understanding. I'm going to buy your 2.5 acres for $300,000, and you're going to sell it to me, and it's going to take me 9 months to get it rezoned, and then another couple months to close. So we should close, Mr. Butler, in about 11 months or so. And everybody says, oh yeah, that's great, no problem, a $5,000 deposit, and when I get it rezoned in 6 or 7 months, then I'll put up another $20,000 in deposit. Mr. Butler says, yeah, that's fine. So we write all that stuff down. And if there's any brokerage commissions to be paid and who's paying what closing costs. And so you just kind of put out the obligations of the party, which is the top right one. And then what's your consideration? What I always did, one of the things we always did was leave $100 of the deposit on the table if we walked. That way nobody could ever say that we didn't provide good and valuable consideration. So if I put up a $5,000 deposit and I walked, I'd let the seller keep $100.
And you like to keep $100 so that you'd only take back 4,900 then of your deposit?
Yeah, because theoretically, if you get your 100% of your deposit back and you don't do any work product, you're really not giving them any consideration other than your promise. And that doesn't work real well in court. So if your seller chose to do what your seller said, which is I'm not going to sell it to you now because you did all this work and it's great, and I'm going to keep it and not sell it to you, they could potentially come back and say that you didn't have any consideration of it.
Okay. Gotcha.
That happened. It didn't happen here, but it happened for the company that I worked for in Atlanta. And they had promised to give him the work product, but they never did any work product. And he didn't want to sell it to him because the market changed like a couple of years ago when everything, doubled in value. And he said, screw you. And they said, no, screw you. And he won in court.
Okay. Well, that's unfortunately, that's where some things go. Hopefully, when you're at this letter of intent time right here, you're probably the seller is probably the happiest that he's going to be, and you're the happiest that you're going to be. And so it's always good to get things in writing, and then get the contract in writing, get the money put down, and then everybody can go back to what's written in the agreement and say, well, this is what we agreed to, so I guess I'm going to live by that.
Yeah, typically it's a couple weeks from a letter of intent to going into a bona fide contract. So you want to make sure if you have any weird things, like on my a deal that I'm doing right now in Deltona, I'm asking the apartment developer to give us 2 acres worth of retention. And that's kind of a weird density thing, but I'm asking for that property back to do either shared retention or provide me with 2 acres that I can put retention on, because he doesn't really need the land.
Interesting. Yeah, and I know of one place in Apopka, and you probably know about it too, where they put in a restaurant and they needed more parking, and so they paid the church to have additional parking in their parking lot, because the church only had people there Wednesdays and Sundays, and it worked out to get the approval on that.
That's, by the way, usually called a cross-access easement.
Okay, cross-access easement.
Is what you would create for that.
Interesting.
That's pretty common when you look at out parcels out in front of, let's say, an out parcel out in front of a restaurant, Chick-fil-A out in front of a Walmart. They'll have cross-access easements for ingress and egress, and then potentially parking for overflow parking.
Cool. Good stuff. All right, now we're going to, it's 2 weeks later, we're going to reduce it to a contract. You said sometimes you go straight to contract, but sometimes it's LOI and straight to contract.
It depends on how, whether or not I have a broker on the other side and how sophisticated the seller is, et cetera. If there's any question on whether or not we, I like to do the LOI on the bigger deals just to make sure that there's no question on what any of the terms were. And then once everybody gets to see it in writing, they say, oh, no, that's not what I meant. Let's do this. And then you can change it before you get into the time spending of doing a FAR bar. When I do a FAR bar, it takes me at least an hour. And so I can do a LOI in 15 minutes. So sometimes, a lot of times, smaller deals, like if I was buying a lot, a regular lot that I was going to put 12 units on, let's say I was buying, an acre and a half that I could put 12 units on, and it was already in a city urban type area. And, maybe I was going to get some grant money to help with it. There's already water and sewer there. There's already drainage there. A lot of stuff is already there. So you don't really have any, it's just, are you going to buy it and close? All you have to do is go get your site plan approved. So, and that's usually kind of a short thing. So in those cases, we would do all our due diligence before we would ship them a contract. And I would give you a contract with probably a fairly short closing date, because there's nothing to approve. There's no water management. There's no anything. It's just whether or not my parking in city or county says. It's usually a city, whether the city will say yes or no.
I know you're a broker, real estate broker, so you kind of know FAR bar and contracts and things like that. But if some of our people are not brokers, would you suggest that they get the contract reviewed before signing, or is that a good idea, or what's your thinking on that?
If you're not experienced or you don't have an advisor, and we talked on the first couple of weeks about whether or not you had a real estate specialist on your team, you may not be licensed, but you may have a licensed person, or you may be using a broker. You would want to have somebody that was really familiar with the contract form. If not, then I would highly recommend having an attorney review it. Like we're doing a participating deal right now. It's really complicated, but we're doing it. The buyers are coming in with 1031 money, when a 1031 is an exchange. So when they sell one piece of property, they can exchange into the purchase of a new property and defer the taxes. The issues there is it has to be the exact same company. So they're coming in as a financial partner, if you will, but in order to make the 1031 work, they have to have it in the same company. So I went to the attorney, and I was actually there this morning to have him write language to protect me when we close next week on this property, that it's going to be in their company name. How do we protect me that I get my piece of the deal? So
okay,
there
you mean
may
the commission?
No, not commission. This is a participation. So
Oh, you're participating in it.
But
Okay.
I can't sort of, and then there's also a really interesting issue is how do I make sure that I get long-term capital gain on the deal, which becomes a tax question. So in some of those weird things, you want an attorney to certainly review some of the language. And my partners have an attorney And so we're kind of going back and forth between the attorneys to make sure that everybody's okay with everything. So in those kind of cases, if I'm just going to buy a lot from Leanne for 50 grand, this acre and a half, I probably don't need an attorney to review that contract. It's whether or not I'm going to give her the check, the 50 grand in, 90 days or whatever. So
Do
I think-
all real estate agents have a fiduciary responsibility to both seller and buyer, or is there
There's
is there
new thing called
exceptions?
there's a new thing called a transactional broker or agent, which lets that person, the agent, be kind of a in-between party. So they don't really represent the buyer or the seller. It used to be a long time ago that if I had a listing contract, I represented the seller and I had to give my full attention to the seller. Now they've given this transactional broker where they're allowed to make the deal, if you will, where they don't specifically represent either party.
That's important if
also-
you're a buyer.
Yeah,
That's important to know if you're a buyer. Yeah.
And if you have what they have single agent. So if I, let's say, hired Mr. Butler as my agent to represent me, he could tell everybody that he was a single agent broker working on behalf of the buyer. So his fiduciary responsibility would be to the buyer.
Buyer
Or
only.
vice versa.
Okay. Okay. All right. Let's move on here. What's an option agreement? We talked about a contract. We talked about LOI, a contract, purchase and sale agreement. Now we have an option.
Most of our contracts are actually nothing more than an option agreement. It's a real estate contract, but it basically says it's unilateral, meaning that if I can get the stuff done that I want to get done, I'll buy it. If I can't, I won't. So that's where you have limited risk factors. As I get to a point, let's say in my rezoning, and the county says absolutely no way in hell is this ever going to go through, and I go talk to like 5 commissioners, and they all say no way, we just can't do it in this particular location. What you want to do, then we'll drop it. We get our deposit back less our $100, and we give the seller our work product and move on. So that's why it's unilateral. It's totally up to us whether or not we're going to move forward or not.
Cool. I just came up with a few red flags. Do you want to talk about some of the red flags that could pop up along the discovery and the due diligence?
So Leanne's got her acre and a half lot that we've been talking about. And she just, she lives in Apopka, and this property is in Tavares. And she just can't get up there to cut the grass. And the guy that was cutting the grass stopped cutting the grass. So the city comes in and decides to cut the grass for her, and they put a code enforcement lien on the property. So whenever we are buying anything, any property, one of my early due diligence, and we're going to go through real due diligence, probably part of one of the meetings, go through all the different things on due diligence. But one of the things I always do is call code enforcement to see if there's any outstanding code enforcement liens on the property. It's not unusual that when Leanne tells the county to go kiss her ass because she doesn't want to cut the grass, and that they start putting a $250 a day fine on it. So after 3 years, all of a sudden that she owes $67,000 on a lot that's worth 50 grand or whatever. So you have to be careful that you don't pay Leanne $50,000 and then have to turn around and pay the city or county $67,000 on top of it.
Right. Yeah, they don't usually go away. Those code enforcement liens are pretty hard to get off of there.
Everybody has a different way of handling them. Seminole can a lot of times some of the code stuff is handled by the sheriff's department. Marion County, it's all the sheriff's department. Seminole County, it's the sheriff's department. So it depends on where you are, and it depends. Everybody has a different way of releasing the liens. We were successful several times on houses that we did a long time ago, where we got rid of $400,000 worth of code enforcement liens for about $2 grand of administrative type stuff, paid for.
Yeah. And what happens there is, the $250 a day, I mean, they basically, they're making $67,000. It didn't cost them $67,000 to cut the grass, through the summer there. So what they do is they calculate how much did it cost the county to cut the grass. And then once you buy the property and you probably need to know this kind of like ahead of time, but you buy the property and you go before them, you said, I cleaned up the trash and I'm mowing the grass, I'm keeping it. What can we do on these liens? And usually, or at least some counties will go ahead and reduce them down to whatever the administrative costs were. The actual cost of doing the grass, the cleaning and the grass. And a lot of times there used to be a house there and they'll demo the house and usually see a nice lot right there. And you don't realize that there's a lien on it for the county that had to take and demo a house off of the property.
That's a good one. Red flags are wet areas. Other tidal clouds, there could be an encroachment. We did a deal up in St. Augustine where the property was, 50 acres or whatever, and it bordered a row of houses. Well, all those people had, because it had been vacant land there forever, had put their sheds and different things on our property. So in many cases, we had sheds and stuff that were on the property, and that comes out, that's called an encroachment. And that's a tidal cloud, and that comes out when you do the survey. So when the surveyor went out there and went along that south border of the property, he diagrammed where all these sheds were and stuff like that. And then we had to go tell the people to move their sheds.
If they had done an adverse possession before you found out about it, could they have gotten title to that property?
Well, the issues with adverse possession in Florida, again, I don't know outside of Florida, but in Florida, you have to occupy with the property for 7 years. And one of the key things is you have to let the world know that you're occupying it, and then you have to pay the taxes on the property. The real key thing is paying the taxes. So people could have, there's another thing called an easement by prescription, which is 18 years. And you had uninterrupted use of the property for 18 years or longer. There's a potential that you could cause an easement by prescription to happen. I work for a big office building company, and people in Tampa used to cross the northwest corner of the property, kind of in a triangle. And they've been doing it for years and years, forever. And when they went to do the office building, the people filed a suit for easement by prescription, and they won. And it was significant because it took a probably 20, 25 parking places away out of the deal, which limited how much building they could put there. It was kind of interesting. Endangered species, the wet areas in endangered species is usually handled by the same guy, person, company, which is gal, environmental consultant. They'll do what they call T&E, which is threatened and endangered, and they'll look at what your wet areas are, and then they do a report, and then they'll document it usually aerially or whatever, and they'll flag the wetland areas, and then your surveyor then goes out and picks up the flags. They do a lot of it now because of the advanced technology with GPS. My environmental consultant can go walk the wetland line with its handheld GPS. It's about a little bit bigger than your cell phone. And he clicks a button and it goes into the program. He can send that program to the surveyor, and the surveyor can plot it right off of because they're good. A lot of that stuff now is good to within an inch.
Wow.
So it saves it saves a whole bunch of money, not having to have them flag it. And then the surveyor go back out and survey where the flags are and all that. They just punch the button on their, they do this same thing with tree surveys now.
Cool. What about unhappy neighbors? Usually when you're doing a zoning change or something like that, you have to post the property for 30 days, and you might have a hearing. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, when you're going through a rezoning, there's a public notice process. So what they'll do is you have to put a sign on the property, but you'll have to send a letter out to everybody within, usually it's 500 feet. Occasionally you have 1,000 feet. And then in certain areas like Titusville different areas, they'll make you have a neighborhood meeting. And in the neighborhood meeting, you get to show your concept plan. And so on these larger vacant land that abut single family residential, the guy who sold the people the single family residential house said, "Oh, you don't have to worry, Mr. Butler. They'll never ever develop that land behind you." And so now I'm coming in 20 years later to develop the land behind you, and I'm going to put tiny houses, or I'm going to put houses or commercial or whatever it's going to be within 25 feet of your property line. And that's what's called not in my backyard, the NIMBY, N-I-M-B-Y people, not in my backyard. So most of those people are going to come out and bitch and complain about what you're doing. Not all of them. So in the neighborhood meeting, it's best to try to get, do landscaping and buffering and do different things that aren't going to cost you so much money as building a 6-foot-high concrete wall, for example.
Right. Politics never enter into it, does it?
No,
Into your
never,
approvals?
never. So we lost the deal in Titusville, for those of you who weren't here a couple of meetings ago. 2 of the commissioners were up for election, and 3 people came to bitch and complain about it. And this was a developer who was gone way out of their way to take what was going to be, could be commercial land and make it a low density residential. And the houses were going to be 1 story, guaranteed to be 1 story. They were going to be at least 100 feet away from the property border. I mean, it was, and one lady came from a half a mile away and didn't like it. And they were, saying too much traffic, and the developer didn't do quite as good a job as he could have in terms of the traffic and some of the potential red flags that came up. But they, because the commissioners didn't want to lose 3 votes, they denied it. And in this particular instance, it's really kind of interesting, because in many instances, if they deny it, you can't come back in for at least another year. So if you're tippy-topping on top of your game, if it looks like they're going to deny it, you ask them to table it so they don't actually vote to deny it, and give you a month or 2 to go back and talk to the neighbors and see if you can work more things out to get your development approved.
Cool.
So the political comment, our Volusia County deal, we have 6 of the 7 commissioners were up for re-election. The chairman wasn't, and the gal was the commissioner for our district lost, which I think is a good thing, because she was a little concerned about the neighbors. So
that was a good thing for your project.
good thing for our project.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's the last slide that we have. Let me just check and see if there's anything else. Yeah, this one's just notes actually that I was taking. So at this point, I think I'm just going to stop sharing, and we can ask questions if there's any questions. If not, we can wrap things up. If anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. If not, we can call this one a wrap. Turn it over to Leanne. Take it away.
Leanne and her $50,000 acre-and-a-half lot. I'll see you later.
Yeah.
I like that. Well, I guess there's no questions. And tomorrow night, we have our inspector chat. We'll have our inspectors answering questions. Sherry will probably have some things she wants to bring up. So I don't have anything. If you guys don't have any questions, we will see you tomorrow. Same time, same place. Hope you have a lovely evening.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Robin.